What does it feel like to watch your own body betray you, piece by piece, while the entire world pretends you're still a god? In the winter of 1547, inside the frostbitten walls of Whitehall Palace, the most feared monarch in English history lay dying. But this wasn't the death of a king. This was something far more horrific. This was the slow, agonizing collapse of a man who had once moved heaven and earth, now unable to move himself. The ulcer had been festering for over a decade, eating away at the tissue, boring deeper into the bone. Some days it would seal itself shut, trapping the infection inside, and Henry would roar in pain, so violent that guards outside the door would freeze in terror. Other days it would burst open, releasing a torrent of fluid so foul that even the most hardened physicians gagged. But Henry VIII wasn't just dying from his leg. He was dying from everything. Picture him now. Not the young athletic prince who once captivated Europe with his golden hair and powerful build. Not the charismatic ruler who wrote poetry and played the lute. No, this Henry was something else entirely. His body had swollen to grotesque proportions, a mountain of flesh that required mechanical devices just to move him from room to room. His waist measured 54 inches. His neck had disappeared into folds of fat that made breathing laborious. When he tried to stand, which became increasingly rare, his legs buckled under the weight of a body that had ballooned to nearly 400 pounds. The portraits from these final years tell a story the artists tried desperately to hide. They painted him seated, always seated, in magnificent robes designed to conceal rather than reveal. But everyone in the palace knew the truth. The king couldn't climb stairs anymore. He couldn't ride the horses he once loved. He couldn't even sleep lying down because the excess fluid in his lungs would drown him. Instead, he spent his nights propped up on pillows, wheezing and gasping, his mind drifting between consciousness and fevered dreams. His mind. That was perhaps the cruelest betrayal of all. Henry had always been brilliant, cunning, educated, fluent in 3 languages. He'd been a scholar king, a patron of the arts, a man who changed the course of religion itself to satisfy his desires. But now, in these final months, his thoughts would scatter like leaves in wind. One moment, he'd be discussing affairs of state with perfect clarity. The next, he'd be screaming at advisors who weren't there or weeping about wives who'd been dead for years. The pain had become so constant, so overwhelming, that it fractured something deep inside him. His physicians were terrified, and they had every right to be. In Henry's court, bringing bad news to the king could cost you your head. Literally. So they lied. They smiled and assured him he was improving. They concocted elaborate treatment poultices of ground pearls, crushed emeralds mixed with wine, prayers and blessings from holy relics. Nothing worked. Nothing could work! But admitting that would be suicide? The leg ulcer wasn't just a wound. It was a window into the king's mortality, a grotesque reminder that even absolute power couldn't stop the body's rebellion. Medical historians believe the ulcer was caused by chronic venous insufficiency, likely triggered by a devastating jousting accident years earlier. In 1536, Henry had been thrown from his horse, knocked unconscious, his body crushed under the weight of armor and animal. He'd survived, but the damage was done. The circulation in his legs never fully recovered. Blood pooled, tissue died, and what started as a small sore became a gaping wound that would define his final decade. But there was more. So much more. The same accident that damaged his leg might have damaged his brain. In the years following the fall, Henry's personality shifted. The mercurial temperament became unpredictable violence. The political shrewdness became paranoia. 2 of his 6 wives, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, had been executed on his orders, their heads severed from their bodies, while Henry planned his next marriage. His advisors lived in constant fear, never knowing if today would be the day the king's mood turned lethal. And now, as winter gripped London, as 1547 crawled toward its end, everyone in the palace could feel it. The king was dying. Not slowly, not peacefully, but in a drawn-out agony that seemed designed to torture him for every brutal act he'd committed. His servants whispered about it in the corridors. How much weight did it take to lift him now? 4 men. 6. How many more times would the contraption creak and strain under his bulk before it finally broke? How long before the infection spread from his leg to his blood, poisoning everything it touched? But here's what made it truly horrific. Henry knew. In his lucid moments, when the pain briefly subsided and his mind cleared, he understood exactly what was happening. He could feel his empire slipping away, could sense the vultures circling. His young son Edward was just 9 years old, too young to rule, too vulnerable to protect himself from the ambitious men already plotting to control the throne. Everything Henry had built to break from Rome, the religious upheaval, the dynasty he'd destroyed, 5 marriages trying to secure all of it, hung by the thinnest thread. And so he raged against his body, against his physicians, against death itself. But rage couldn't stop what was coming. Nothing could. On particularly bad days, when the pain became unbearable, Henry would demand his doctors drain the wound. They'd pierce the swollen flesh, releasing streams of infection, and for a few hours he'd feel relief. But the relief never lasted. The wound always filled again. The pain always returned. It was a cycle of temporary salvation and inevitable suffering, repeated endlessly, day after day after day. The people of London knew their king was dying, though officially, no one could say it. To even suggest the king's death was an act of treason. But they could read the signs, the cancelled public appearances, the strange silence from the palace, the nervous energy of the courtiers who emerged looking pale and shaken. Something terrible was happening behind those walls. Something the crown was desperately trying to hide. Inside the king's chamber, time moved differently. Days blurred together. Night became indistinguishable from day. The only constants were pain and decay. And in those endless hours, as Henry drifted between sleep and waking, did he think about the men he'd executed? The wives he'd destroyed? The monasteries he'd dissolved? The treasures he'd looted? The lives he'd casually ended with a stroke of his pen? Or did he think only of himself, of the young prince he'd once been? Full of promise and power, now trapped in this failing shell. As January advanced, something began to shift in the palace. The physicians' faces grew more grave, the whispered conversations more urgent. Henry's confessor was summoned more frequently. Arrangements were being made, quietly, carefully, because everyone knew the end was close now. But what happened in those final hours would shock even those who thought they'd witnessed everything. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Kurama, received the summons just after midnight on January 20th. Ride to Whitehall immediately. The king requires you. Cranmer knew what this meant. After decades serving Henry through marriages, executions, and religious revolution, he recognized the weight of such a message. He mounted his horse in darkness, the frozen roads of London stretching before him like a path to judgment itself. When he arrived at the palace, the silence struck him first. Not the bustling energy of a royal household, but something heavier, expectation wrapped in dread. Guards stood rigid at their posts, their eyes forward, refusing to acknowledge what everyone felt pressing down on them. The king's apartments, usually filled with advisors and courtiers jostling for position, were nearly empty. Only a handful of men remained. The inner circle. The ones who'd dared to stay close while death prowled the corridors. Cranmer entered the bedchamber. The smell was worse than he'd imagined. Sweet perfumes fought against putrefaction and lost. Candles burned everywhere, hundreds of them, as if light itself could hold back the darkness gathering around Henry's massive frame. The king lay propped against an absurd mountain of pillows and cushions, his breathing labored and wet. His face, once commanding and fierce, had become a swollen mask. His eyes, when they opened, held something Cranmer had never seen there before: fear. But Henry wasn't ready. Not yet. He still clung to consciousness with the same iron will that had bent England to his desires. When Cranmer approached, the king's hand twitched, a gesture that might have been recognition. His lips moved, but the words came out strangled, barely audible. The archbishop leaned closer. close enough to feel the heat radiating from that dying body, close enough to hear the death rattle beginning to form in the royal lungs. What happened next would be debated for centuries. Some claimed Henry confessed his sins in those final hours. Others insisted he refused confession, convinced of his own righteousness even as his body failed. The truth, as it often is, was more complicated. Henry drifted between moments of clarity and delirium. He spoke to people long dead. He issued orders for battles already fought. He called out for Jane Seymour, his third wife, the only one he truly loved, dead now for nearly a decade after giving him his precious son. Outside the chamber, a different drama unfolded. Edoardo Seymour, the uncle of 9-year-old Prince Edward, paced the antechamber with predatory focus. The moment Henry died, everything would change. Power would shift. Whoever controlled the young prince would control England. Seymour wasn't the only one calculating these moves. Thomas Wriothesley, John Dudley, William Paget, all of them waited, watching, preparing for the scramble that would follow the king's last breath. But there was a problem. A massive, terrifying problem that no one dared speak aloud. According to English law, it was treason to predict or discuss the king's death. Even now, with Henry clearly dying, to acknowledge it openly was to risk your own execution. So they existed in this bizarre state of denial, making plans for an event they legally couldn't admit was happening. The physicians continued their charade. They mixed new potions, applied fresh bandages to the ulcerated leg, murmured reassurances to a man who could barely hear them. But their hands shook. They'd seen enough death to recognize its signature, and it was written all over the patient. Hours, they thought. Maybe a day if he was stubborn enough? And Henry VIII had always been stubborn. As dawn broke on January 28th, something shifted in the room. The gasping breaths that had punctuated the night grew shallower. The periods of unconsciousness stretched longer. Cranmer, who'd remained at the bedside, watched the life slowly drain from England's most powerful monarch. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a grand exit Henry might have choreographed for himself. It was just a body giving up, piece by piece, system by system. At one point, late in the morning, Henry's eyes opened with sudden clarity. The fog lifted for just a moment, and he saw Cranmer there beside him. The king's hand. That hand which had signed death warrants and marriage contracts, which had held scepters and broken with Rome, reached out weakly. Cranmer took it, feeling the clammy skin, the absence of strength that had once seemed limitless. "Mercy," Henry whispered. Just that single word. Cranmer would later claim the king asked for God's mercy, that his final thoughts were of salvation. But others in the room heard something different, a plea, perhaps, or a question. Mercy for what? For the wives he'd destroyed. For the men he'd executed on whims. For the monasteries torn down. The treasures seized. The country thrown into religious chaos to satisfy his desires. Or was he asking for mercy from the pain itself, begging for this endless suffering to finally stop? The question hung in the air, unanswered, as Henry's eyes closed again. His breathing grew more irregular. Long pauses stretched between breaths, each one making the witnesses wonder if it would be the last. The massive body that had once danced and jousted and commanded armies lay perfectly still, except for the shallow rise and fall of his chest. In those final hours, time seemed suspended. The palace held its breath along with the dying king. Servants frozen in their duties. Guards standing like statues. Courtiers pretending to discuss mundane matters while their ears strained for any sound from the royal chamber. All of England, unknowingly, balanced on the edge of a new era. Around 2 a.m. on January 28th, Henry VIII's breathing changed one final time. The rattling in his lungs grew louder, more desperate. Cranmer squeezed the king's hand, whispering prayers. The other men in the room moved closer, witnesses to history's judgment. Then, with no ceremony, no final words, no grand proclamation, it stopped. The breathing simply ceased. The chest fell and didn't rise again. The hand in Cranmer's grip went slack. The King of England, defender of the faith, supreme head of the church, the man who'd reshaped his nation through sheer force of will, was dead. But here's where it gets truly strange. 4 hours after Henry's death, No one announced it. The body lay in that chamber, growing cold, while the inner circle argued in hushed, frantic voices. They had a problem, a legal and political nightmare that threatened to throw the kingdom into chaos. The king's will was sealed. No one, except Henry, knew its complete contents. Who would be named Lord Protector for young Edward? Who would hold power during the Regency? These questions had to be answered before the death was announced, or civil war might erupt before Henry was even in his grave. So they waited. They made deals and whispers while the king's body cooled a few rooms away. For nearly 3 days, England had no king, and almost no one knew it. The palace carried on its routines. Guards changed shifts. Meals were prepared and served 2 chambers where no one ate them. Courtiers arrived seeking audiences that would never be granted. All while Henry VIII lay dead, his secret kept by the few men who'd witnessed his end. During those hidden days, something had to be done about the body. In the winter chill, decay worked slowly but inevitably. The same physicians who'd failed to save him now worked to preserve him, or at least to make him presentable for the public mourning that would eventually come. They cleaned the wound one final time. They dressed him in royal vestments. They positioned the enormous corpse to suggest majesty rather than the painful collapse that had actually occurred. And they discovered something that would only add to the horror of Henry's final days. His body, already grotesque in life, began to bloat further in death. The gases of decomposition filled that massive frame even faster than normal. By the second day, the servants tasked with moving him reported that he'd grown heavier still, that the skin was stretching tight, that the smell, despite all their efforts, was becoming overwhelming. When they finally announced Henry's death on January 5th, 3 days late, London erupted in carefully orchestrated grief. Church bells tolled. Black cloth draped every public building. Citizens who'd feared and hated the tyrant now wept for their departed sovereign, because that's what subjects did. The official story spoke of a peaceful death, surrounded by devoted servants, the king dying with God's name on his lips. They didn't mention the screaming, the festering wound, the mechanical lifts required to move him, the paranoid rage, the body that had become its own prison. All of that was sealed away, buried as deep as Henry himself would soon be. But the men who'd been in that room, they knew. They'd seen what time and excess and absolute power had done to a man who'd once been called the handsomest prince in Christendom. They'd watched the slow-motion horror of a body rebelling against the mind that commanded it. And in their nightmares, they'd continue to see it, the swollen flesh, the weeping wound, the fear in those royal eyes as death approached with neither mercy nor hurry. What none of them yet realized was that Henry's death would trigger something far worse than anyone anticipated. The struggle for power they'd tried to manage in those secret 3 days was about to explode into the open. And the England Henry left behind would be torn apart by the very forces he'd spent his life trying to control. The announcement of Henry's death rippled through England like a stone cast into dark water, the waves spreading outward in ever-widening circles of uncertainty. But while commoners mourned in the streets and priests offered prayers in churches, inside Whitehall Palace, a vicious game had already begun. Edward Seymour moved first, with the ruthless efficiency of a man who'd been planning this moment for years. Within hours of the public announcement, he'd secured custody of the young Prince Edward, whisking the 9-year-old boy away from his apartments under the pretense of protection. Whoever controlled the king controlled the kingdom, and Seymour intended to be that person. But the will Henry's final testament contained a surprise no one had anticipated. When it was finally opened and read before the assembled council, the room fell into stunned silence. Henry hadn't named a single Lord Protector. Instead, he'd created a council of regency, 16 men who were supposed to rule collectively until Edward came of age. It was, on paper, a brilliant solution. No single man would have absolute power, preventing the very tyranny Henry himself had embodied. In practice, it was a recipe for disaster. The will revealed something else, too. Something that sent whispers racing through the palace. Henry had made provisions for all his children, not just Edward, but also his daughters Mary and Elizabeth. Both previously declared bastards, both now restored to the line of succession. It was as if, in his final lucid moments, Henry had tried to undo some of the damage he'd caused. The wives he'd discarded, the children he'd delegitimized perhaps. Guilt had finally pierced that armor of absolute certainty. Or perhaps it was just one more political calculation from a man who'd spent his life playing chess with human lives. While the living fought over Henry's legacy, the dead king presented a more immediate problem. His body needed to be transported from Whitehall to Windsor Castle for burial, a journey of roughly 20 miles through the winter countryside. But moving a 400-pound corpse, already swelling with decomposition, was no simple task. The royal coffin, specially constructed to accommodate Henry's enormous size, was a monument to excess itself. Lead line, reinforced with iron bands. It required 20 men just to lift. The funeral procession that left London on February 14th was unlike anything England had seen. At its head rode nobles in black cloth, their horses draped in mourning vestments. Behind them came the massive wheeled carriage bearing Henry's coffin, creaking under the weight. Then followed hundreds more courtiers, clergy, representatives from every corner of the realm. It stretched for miles. This river of black-clad humanity, moving slowly through villages where people lined the roads to watch their former king pass by one final time. But something went wrong at Sion Abbey, where the procession stopped for the night. The coffin was moved into the chapel, positioned with great ceremony on a raised platform. Guards were posted! Prayers were said. Then everyone retired for the night, leaving Henry's body alone in the darkness. What happened next would become legend, though the truth was both simpler and more grotesque than any myth. Sometime during that night, the lead coffin split open. The pressure from the decomposing body, the gases, the fluids, the sheer mass pressing outward proved too much for even those reinforced seals. A sound like a thunderclap echoed through the empty chapel. The rupture released everything the coffin had contained. Blood and putrefied matter leaked onto the stone floor, pooling beneath the platform, the smell so overpowering that the guards outside initially refused to investigate, thinking perhaps the devil himself had entered the chapel. When morning came and the damage was discovered, panic seized the funeral party. This wasn't just a practical disaster, it was a sign, an omen. Some whispered that God was passing judgment, that Henry's corrupted body was making manifest the corruption of his soul. Others, more practically minded, worried about the scandal if word got out. Servants were sworn to secrecy. The mess was cleaned as best it could be. The coffin was resealed and reinforced. The procession continued. But the dogs knew! Stray dogs from the area, drawn by the smell of death, had gathered around the chapel during the night. They'd lapped at the blood seeping beneath the doors. This detail dogs feeding on the leaked remains of England's King Wazoo, perfect, too horrible, too suppressed completely. It spread as rumor, as whisper, as the kind of story that gets told in taverns and remembered for generations. Whether entirely true or embellished, it captured something essential about Henry's end. The mighty fallen, the sacred rendered profane, power reduced to meat for skin. At Windsor, Henry was finally laid to rest beside Jane Seymour, his third wife, in the vault beneath St. George's Chapel. The ceremony was magnificent. 3 full days of masses and processions and ritual. But beneath the pageantry, everyone present understood what was really being buried. Not just a man, but an entire era. The England Henry had created through violence and will was about to be torn apart by the men he'd left in charge of it. And they wasted no time. Seymour, having secured young Edward, now moved to consolidate power. He convinced the other council members to name him Lord Protector after all, arguing that the Regency Council was too unwieldy, that England needed strong singular leadership. Within weeks of Henry's burial, Seymour had essentially made himself king in all but name. He granted himself new titles, seized lands, enriched his allies. The other councillors watched, powerless or complicit, as everything Henry had tried to prevent came to pass. But here's what makes the story of Henry's final days truly horrifying. It wasn't just the physical decay, the pain, the undignified end. It was what that decay revealed about the nature of absolute power itself. For 38 years, Henry had bent reality to his will. He'd broken from Rome because the Pope wouldn't grant him a divorce. He'd executed wives, ministers, monks, anyone who stood in his way. He'd convinced himself and forced England to believe that his desires and God's will were identical. He'd built an entire mythology around his own and then his body betrayed him. Slowly. publicly, undeniably. The ulcer on his leg, that festering wound that refused to heal, became a symbol of everything his power couldn't control. He could order men's deaths, but couldn't order his own flesh to mend. He could reshape the church, but couldn't reshape his own arteries. He could take whatever he wanted from whomever he wanted, but he couldn't take back time or health or the consequences of decades of excess. The physicians who had attended him understood this in ways they could never speak aloud. Dr. Thomas Wendy, who'd been with Henry until the end, would carry the horror of those final months to his own grave. Years later, in private correspondence, he admitted that watching the king deteriorate had shaken his faith not just in medicine, but in the entire structure of monarchy itself. How could divine right reside in a body so grotesquely human? How could God's chosen vessel leak pus and scream in pain and require mechanical devices just to move from bed to chair? These were dangerous thoughts in Tudor England. Thoughts that could cost a man his life. But they infected everyone who'd witnessed Henry's end. The carefully maintained fiction that kings were somehow different, somehow elevated above ordinary mortality, Henry's death, had ripped that fiction apart. And in its place, a vacuum had formed. A void that ambitious men rushed to fill. Young Edward, now Edward VI, sat on his father's throne but understood nothing of what swirled around him. At 9 years old, he'd been trained to be king, but not to survive the predators his father had left in charge. The boy was intelligent, pious, serious, everything Henry had wanted in an heir. But he was also fragile, both politically and physically. Those who studied him closely noticed the pallor of his skin, the persistent cough, the thinness of his frame. He had his father's Tudor blood, but he'd also inherited something else, a weakness in the lungs, perhaps, or a susceptibility to infection. The same bodily betrayal that had destroyed his father was already taken root in the son. But Edward's health was a secret carefully guarded. To admit the king was weak was to invite chaos. So the boy performed his duties, attended councils where men 3 times his age made decisions in his name, signed documents he barely understood. And at night, alone in his chambers, did he think about his father, about the bloated monster Henry had become, about the screaming and the smell and the mechanical lifts. Edward had been kept away from Henry's sick room during those final weeks, but he'd heard the stories. Everyone had heard the stories. Meanwhile, the religious revolution Henry had started began to devour itself. During his lifetime, Henry had maintained a peculiar balance, breaking from Rome, but keeping many Catholic practices, executing both Protestant reformers and Catholic loyalists with equal enthusiasm. His Church of England existed in a strange middle ground, reformed but not too reformed, traditional but not too traditional. It was, like everything about Henry, defined entirely by his personal whims. Now those whims were gone, and the zealots on both sides saw their chance. Edoardo Shima, the Lord Protector, was a committed Protestant. He immediately began pushing England toward more radical reforms. Icons were stripped from churches. Masses were banned. The old rituals Henry had preserved were suddenly deemed papist superstition. Catholic nobles watched in horror as everything familiar was dismantled. But they were powerless for now. They waited, plotted, and remembered. In the north, where Catholic sympathies ran deep, whispers of rebellion began. Had Henry lived another decade, his sheer force of personality might have held the country together, but Henry was rotting in his tomb at Windsor, and the kingdom was fracturing along the fault lines he'd created. The execution of Henry's corpse's betrayal wasn't just physical, it was metaphysical. Every decision he'd made, every person he'd destroyed, every institution he'd overturned had been justified by the absolute certainty of his own righteousness. God was on his side. God had chosen him. God approved of everything he did. But then why had God allowed him to die like that? Why the pain? Why the humiliation? Why the body bursting open in a chapel, feeding dogs? These questions haunted the men who'd served him. They looked at young Edward and wondered how long before the same fate claimed him. They looked at each other and wondered who would be next. Because power in Tudor England had always been dangerous, but Henry had made it lethal. He'd normalized execution as a tool of policy. He'd made terror routine. And now that terror was turning inward, consuming the very system he'd created. Thomas Wriothesley, one of the council members, made the mistake of opposing Seymour's reforms to vote. Within months, he was stripped of his position, arrested, interrogated. The charges were vague treason, conspiracy, the usual accusations. He avoided execution only through desperate groveling and the intervention of allies. But the message was clear. Henry might be dead, but his methods lived on. The machine of state terror he'd built was running on its own now, unstoppable, grinding up anyone who stood in its way. And still, the secrets piled up. The true contents of Henry's will remained disputed. Some claimed it had been altered after his death. Signatures forged, provisions changed to benefit Seymour and his allies. The circumstances of those 3 hidden days between death and announcement grew murkier with each telling. Who had really been in the room when Henry died? What were his actual final words? Had he really asked for mercy? Or was that story invented to make his end seem more palatable? The historical record would never fully answer these questions. Too many people had too much to hide. The official accounts, written by men who'd benefited from Henry's death, painted the picture they needed. A good king dying peacefully, his kingdom secure, his legacy assured. But the unofficial accounts, the servants' gossip, the physician's private letters, the rumors that spread through London's streets told a different story. They spoke of horror and stench and madness. They spoke of a tyrant, brought low by the very flesh that had enabled his tyranny. In the chapels and cathedrals of England, priests preached about Henry's soul, praying for his salvation despite the murders, the marriages, the ransacking of holy places. But privately, many wondered, what does God do with a man like Henry VIII? What judgment awaits someone who made themselves the head of a church, who executed wives and ministers and monks, who died screaming in pain with an open wound leaking corruption? If there was a hell, surely it had been preparing a special place for him. If there was justice beyond the mortal world, surely it would be terrible to behold. Yet here's the deepest horror, the realization that came slowly to those who'd lived through it all. Henry's physical decay, as grotesque as it was, wasn't the worst part. The worst part was understanding that the decay had always been there, hidden beneath the pageantry and power. The wound in his leg wasn't the beginning of his fall, it was just when the rot became visible. Henry had been corrupt all along, morally, if not physically, and everyone had pretended not to notice because he was the king. The ulcer was just making manifest what had always existed. The obesity that trapped him in his own body was the physical manifestation of appetites that had never known restraint. The pain that made him cruel was exposing a cruelty that had been there from the start, waiting for an excuse. His body wasn't betraying him, it was revealing him. And if that was true about Henry, what did it mean for everyone else? For the nobles who'd enabled him, for the people who'd cheered his proclamations, for the priests who'd blessed his actions. If the king's corruption had been visible all along to anyone willing to look, what did that make those who'd closed their eyes? These were the questions that kept men awake in the months after Henry's death. Not worry about politics or power or religion. Those were simple, manageable problems. But the deeper realization that they'd all been complicit, that they'd all known on some level what Henry was, and they'd all chosen to ignore it because acknowledging it would cost too much. The country Henry left behind was sick with his sickness. The violence would continue for decades, religious persecutions, executions, rebellions put down with mass hanging. Edward would die young, probably from tuberculosis, after a reign of just 6 years. Mary would burn Protestants by the hundreds, trying to drag England back to Catholicism. Elizabeth would execute Catholics and consolidate the Protestant church, ruling with her father's ruthlessness, if not his excess. The chaos Henry had unleashed wouldn't end for generations. But in those first months after his burial, something else was happening beneath the surface of political intrigue and religious strife. People were beginning to understand that the monarchy itself had been irrevocably changed. The myth of the divine king had died with Henry in that fetid room at Whitehall. Everyone who'd seen or heard about his final days now knew kings could rot. Kings could scream. Kings could lie in their own filth while their bodies ate themselves alive. There was nothing divine about it. This knowledge, quiet and subversive, would spread through England like an infection of its own. It wouldn't topple the monarchy, not yet, not for another century, but it planted seeds. Seeds of doubt. Seeds of question. Seeds that would eventually grow into the realization that if kings were just men, then perhaps they didn't deserve absolute power over life and death. But there was one more secret, one final horror that remained buried with Henry in his lead-lined tomb. And when it finally came to light, it would reveal something about those last days that no one had suspected. In 1813, workers at Windsor Castle were conducting repairs to the royal vault beneath St. George's Chapel. The stone floor had settled over the centuries and concerned that the royal tombs might be damaged. They carefully opened the vault to inspect its contents. What they found would remain classified for decades, discussed only in hushed conversations among a select few who were granted access to the official reports. But eventually, the truth leaked out, as truth always does. Henry VIII's coffin had failed. Completely. The lead that was supposed to preserve him had instead trapped the gases of decomposition, creating pressure that eventually burst the seals. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was what remained inside. Or rather, what didn't remain? The body had liquefied. Nearly 300 years after death, the remains inside that coffin were mostly fluida dark. Viscous soup that had once been the most powerful man in England. The skeleton was there. Massive, even in its bare form, but it was partially collapsed, the bones softened and corrupted by the chemicals of decay. The skull, that head which had worn the crown and ordered executions and broken with Rome, had a crack running through it. Whether from decomposition or from something that happened during those final agonizing days, no one could say. But here's what made the discovery truly haunting. They found fabric fragments preserved in the sludge. Pieces of the royal vestments Henry had been buried in, and caught in those fragments were strands of hair not from his head, which had gone bald and thin by the end, but from his beard. That famous red-gold beard, turned brown and brittle by time, was still clinging to the remnants of his burial shroud. It was as if some small part of him refused to let go, refused to fully dissolve into nothingness. The workers who'd opened the vault reported something else. Something that was never officially recorded but passed down through their families. The smell, they said, was indescribable. Not just decay. Old tombs smelled of decay. This was different. Sweeter, heavier. One of them, years later, told his grandson that it reminded him of the battlefield after a summer rain when the bodies had been lying for days. Another said it was like walking into an old church that had been sealed up and forgotten, where the air itself had gone rotten. They resealed the vault quickly. Whatever remained of Henry VIII went back into the darkness. But the knowledge of what they'd found spread through certain circles. Historians debated its meaning. Religious scholars saw in it confirmation of divine judgment. Medical experts recognized it as the natural consequence of a body that had been diseased and massive and sealed in lead for centuries. But the real revelation wasn't about the physical remains. It was about what that liquefied corpse represented, the final, absolute erasure of all that power and magnificence. Henry had spent his life accumulating things. Wives, titles, lands, treasures, authority. He'd torn England apart to satisfy his desires. He'd made himself semi-divine, the supreme head of church and state. And in the end, time had reduced him to a puddle in a lead box. Not even the bones remained intact. This was the ultimate horror of Henry VIII's final days. Not the pain or the stench or the humiliation of dying slowly while everyone watched. It was the knowledge, had he been able to see it, that nothing, absolutely nothing, would survive. Not his body! Not his intentions! Not the church he'd created or the dynasty he'd tried to secure. Within a century of his death, his son would be dead. His daughter Mary would be remembered as Bloody Mary for her persecutions, and his daughter Elizabeth would die childless, ending the Tudor line completely. Everything he'd built would either transform beyond recognition or collapse entirely. The England that existed in 1547, when Henry died, would be unrecognizable by 1600. The religious settlement he'd tried to impose would give way to something else entirely. The absolute monarchy he'd perfected would eventually be challenged and overthrown. Even Windsor Castle itself, where his liquefied remains rested, would see monarchs come and go, revolutions and wars. change is so profound that Henry's world would seem like ancient history. But back in those final hours at Whitehall, Henry couldn't have known any of this. In his lucid moments, when the pain briefly subsided, what did he think would happen? Did he believe his son would rule for decades? Did he imagine his church would stand forever? Did he picture himself being remembered as a great king? Perhaps even a saint? Or in the darkness of those winter nights, did some part of him understand that he'd destroyed more than he'd built, that his legacy would be written in blood and chaos? The men who stood vigil around his deathbed certainly knew. They watched him struggle for each breath, and they thought about their own futures, about who would rise and who would fall in the scramble for power that was coming, about whether their own bodies would someday rot like this, whether their own ambitions would matter at all when the flesh finally gave up. Thomas Crumma, the archbishop, had the clearest view of what was happening. He'd helped Henry break from Rome. He'd validated the king's divorces and marriages. He'd reformed the church according to Henry's whims. And now, holding that dying hand, he understood that he'd enabled a monster. Not consciously, Cranmer genuinely believed he was doing God's work. But the result was the same. He'd given theological cover to a tyrant, and England was paying the price. Within 6 years, Cranmer himself would burn. Queen Mary, Henry's Catholic daughter, would have him executed as a heretic, tied to a stake, and set on fire in Oxford. Before the flames consumed him, Cranmer would thrust the hand that had signed away the monasteries into the fire first, calling it the unworthy hand that had sinned. It was as if Henry's corruption had infected everyone who'd served him, and they all eventually paid for it in blood. But in that moment, at Whitehall, as 1547 turned to morning and Henry's breaths grew farther apart, no one knew what was coming. They only knew what was ending. The age of Henry VIII, with all its splendor and savagery, was dying along with the man who'd defined it, and when that final breath rattled out of his ruined lungs, when the massive body finally went still, the relief in the room was palpable. It was over. The suffering was done. The terror was finished. Except it wasn't. Not really. Because Henry's death didn't end anything, it just changed the form of the chaos. The wound on his leg had been a symbol, but now the wound was England itself, torn open and bleeding, infected with violence and zealotry and the ruthless pursuit of power. The next 100 years would see executions, wars, rebellions, persecutions, all of it flowing from the choices Henry had made and the example he'd set. The king who died in agony had created a kingdom that would agonize for generations. The body that liquefied in its tomb was just an echo of the society that dissolved into conflict and hatred. The stench that filled his chambers in those final days would linger over England for decades to come. And yet there was something almost merciful about time's judgment. Henry had wanted to be remembered forever as a great king. He'd wanted statues and prayers, and his name spoken with reverence. But time had other plans. Time reduced him to a cautionary tale, a warning about what happens when absolute power meets human weakness. Time turned his magnificence into a puddle of decay. Time took his certainty and revealed it as delusion. In the end, the most powerful king in English history became proof of the most basic truth. We all rot. Kings and beggars, saints and sinners, the grave makes no distinctions. The flesh fails. The bones collapse. And whatever we thought we were building, whatever monuments we erected to our own importance, time will grind them to dust. Henry VIII's final days were horrific, not because of the physical suffering, though that was real and terrible. They were horrific because they revealed the lie at the heart of monarchy, of power, of all human pretension to permanence. We are fragile. We are temporary. And no amount of crowns or titles or terror can change that fundamental fact. The sun rose over London on January 28th. Sengo Hekayonjunana, the palace bells began to toll. And in chambers across Whitehall, men who'd feared Henry for decades felt something they'd almost forgotten how to feel hope. Not hope for what was coming, necessarily, but hope that came simply from survival. They had outlived the tyrant. The monster was dead. Whatever happened next, at least it would be different. But as the months passed, and the power struggles intensified and the executions began again under new authorities, some of them must have wondered, had anything really changed? Or had Henry's greatest legacy been teaching them all how to be monsters too? The answer to that question reveals itself slowly, like morning fog lifting from the Thames. Stand now in St. George's Chapel at Windsor, 3 centuries after Henry's burial, and listen to the silence. The stone walls remember nothing. The vaulted ceiling holds no echoes of his screams. Time has a way of erasing even the most terrible sounds, smoothing over the roughest memories until all that remains is story. But stories, it turns out, matter more than monuments. Henry built palaces and dissolved monasteries and accumulated wealth beyond measure. Yet, what survives isn't the gold or the architecture. It's the cautionary tale, the warning written in flesh and blood about what happens when power has no limits and appetite has no end. Every schoolchild in England learns his name, but not because he was great. They learn it because he was terrible, and that terror contains a lesson civilization keeps forgetting. What does it feel like to watch your body betray you while the world pretends you're still a god? The question that opened this story finds its answer not in Henry's final moments, but in what came after. Because the betrayal wasn't just physical. The real betrayal was metaphysical, the revelation that divinity was always a performance. That power was always an illusion. That the distance between king and corpse was measured not in divine right, but in simple time. In the decades following Henry's death, England slowly learned to question what he'd made them accept. Not immediately, that kind of awakening takes generations. But the seeds were planted in that fetid chamber at Whitehall, witnessed by men who would tell their children. Who would eventually raise questions about whether any human should wield the power Henry had claimed. A century after his death, an English king would be put on trial and executed by his own subjects. The divine right Henry embodied so completely would be challenged, broken, redefined. He couldn't have imagined it, but his death made it imaginable. There's a strange poetry in how it happened. Henry spent his life making himself larger than life's 6 wives, countless executions, a break from Rome, the accumulation of absolute power, and his body responded by making him literally larger, grotesquely. So, until the weight of his appetites became the weight that crushed him. The metaphor was so perfect it seemed almost scripted. The man who consumed everything was consumed by his own excess. The king who acknowledged no limits was destroyed by the ultimate limit, mortality. But here's what's easy to miss in the horror and the spectacle. Henry was afraid. The historical sources hint at it in ways they probably didn't intend. The desperate attempts at treatment. The rage when remedies failed. The tears in those final delirious moments. Underneath all that power and arrogance was just a man who knew he was dying badly and couldn't do anything to stop it. In that, he was like everyone who'd ever lived. The crown didn't protect him. The divine right, he claimed, didn't save him. When pain came, he hurt like any other human. When death came, he fought it like any other frightened animal. That humanity that terrified. Suffering humanity beneath the royal vestments is what makes his story resonate 5 centuries later. We watch his final days with a mixture of horror and recognition. Horror at what he became. Recognition that we all carry that same capacity for the wound on his leg that wouldn't heal is every bad choice that compounds, every small corruption that spreads, every moment when we choose power over compassion and convince ourselves it doesn't matter. The liquefied remains found in 1813 were just the physical confirmation of what everyone already knew. Nothing lasts. Not power. Not fear. Not the certainty that was somehow different, somehow exempt from the rules that govern every other human life. Time dissolves it all, the good and the evil, the magnificent and the monstrous, into the same anonymous dust. Yet somehow, that truth isn't depressing. It's liberating. If Henry VIII, with all his power and all his cruelty, could be reduced to a puddle in a lead box, then perhaps power itself isn't worth what we sacrifice for it. If the king who ruled absolutely ended up suffering absolutely, then perhaps absolute rule was the problem all along. The horror of his final days contains within it the seed of wisdom, the understanding that our humanity matters more than our authority, that how we treat others matters more than how much we accumulate, that the only legacy that survives is the one written in how we loved or failed to love. Walk through England today, and you'll find Henry everywhere and nowhere. His face stares from paintings in museums, his name appears in history books, his deeds echo through centuries of consequence. But the man himself, gone. Utterly, completely gone. The personality that dominated a nation, the will that bent reality to its desires. The ego that couldn't imagine its own extinction, all of it vanished, leaving only stories and warnings. And maybe that's the final horror, or perhaps the final mercy. We don't get to control what we're remembered for. Henry wanted to be remembered as a great king, a religious reformer, a powerful ruler who secured his dynasty. Instead, he's remembered for his wives, his cruelty, and the grotesque manner of his death. The narrative slipped from his control the moment that last breath left his body. Everything he'd tried to cement in place crumbled. Everything he thought was permanent proved temporary. The lesson echoes across centuries. We are not the monuments we build. We are not the power we accumulate. We are not even the choices we make, though those matter more than we usually admit. We are, finally and only, the impact we have on other lives, the wounds we inflict or heal, the fear we create or dispel, the humanity we honor or destroy. Henry inflicted more wounds than anyone could count. He created fear that lasted generations. He destroyed humanity in pursuit of desires that meant nothing in the end. His final days were his truest days, stripped of pageantry, reduced to pain and fear, and the desperate hope for mercy that might not come. In those moments, the king became simply a man, and the man revealed himself to be profoundly, tragically alone. All the people he had destroyed couldn't save him. All the power he'd wielded couldn't heal him. All the faith he'd claimed couldn't comfort him. He died as everyone dies, uncertain, afraid, hoping that what comes next might be gentler than what came before. 3 centuries later, when they opened his tomb and found only fluid and collapsed bones, it wasn't a surprise. It was a confirmation of what his life had already proven, that flesh fails, power fades, and in the end, we're all just stories told by people who outlive us. The only question that matters is what kind of story we leave behind. Henry's answer echoes through the ages as a warning, whispered in the silence of old chapels and written in the space between what he wanted to be and what he actually was. So what does it feel like to watch your body betray you while everyone pretends you're still a god? It feels like dying alone despite being surrounded by people. It feels like understanding too late that you built nothing that mattered. It feels like the awful clarity that comes when all pretense is stripped away and you're left with only the truth of what you've done and who you've been. It feels, in the end, like being human, which was the one thing Henry spent his life trying not to be. And perhaps that's the greatest horror of all. That in running from his humanity, he lost the only thing that might have saved him, the capacity to love, to forgive, to be forgiven, to be something other than the wound that never healed.